August 1943, Sicily. A four-star general walked into a field hospital and did something so shocking that it nearly cost America one of its greatest military minds. Within minutes, word spread like wildfire through the ranks. Within months, it exploded across America's front pages and threatened to end a brilliant career. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. That moment of disgrace, that scandal that should have destroyed him, became the very reason the Allies won the greatest invasion in military history. The man they called a coward would become the phantom general who fooled Hitler himself. This is the story of George S. Patton and the slapping incident that paradoxically saved D-Day. The date was August 3, 1943. General George S. Patton, commander of the 7th United States Army, was touring the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia in Sicily. His army had just captured Palermo in a stunning race across western Sicily, beating his rival British General Bernard Montgomery to the objective. Patton was riding high, already a national hero back in the United States. The press loved him. His men, though they grumbled about his strict discipline, respected his aggressive tactics that got results. Inside the hospital tent, Patton moved from bed to bed, commending the wounded. He shook hands with men who had lost limbs. He praised soldiers with visible injuries, telling them they were heroes. Then he came to Private Charles H. Cool, an 18-year-old from Mishawaka, Indiana. Cool was sitting slumped on a supply crate, appearing physically uninjured. Patton asked where he was hurt. Cool looked up at the general and said, "I guess I can't take it." What happened next would change the course of World War II, though nobody knew it at the time. According to multiple witness accounts and medical reports filed immediately after, Patton exploded. He called Cool a coward. He slapped the private across the face with his gloves. Then, as hospital staff watched in shock, Patton grabbed Cool by his shirt collar, dragged him toward the tent entrance, and kicked him out of the hospital. As Cool stumbled away, Patton shouted at the hospital commander to never admit such men. He wanted them sent back to their units immediately. Companies should deal with such men, Patton would write in his diary that night, and if they shirk their duty, they should be tried for cowardice and shot. What Patton didn't know, what he couldn't have known in that moment of rage, was that Private Cool was running a high fever. He had malaria, he had chronic dysentery. Cool had been sick repeatedly over the past 10 days, evacuated twice before, and was genuinely ill. But Patton saw no visible wounds, no bandages, no blood. He saw what he believed was a coward shirking his duty while brave men fought and died. Within 48 hours of the incident, Patton issued a memo to all commanders in the 7th Army. It has come to my attention that a very small number of soldiers are going to the hospital on the pretext that they are nervously incapable of combat. Such men are cowards and bring discredit on the army and disgrace to their comrades, whom they heartlessly leave to endure the dangers of battle, while they themselves use the hospital as a means of escape. George Patton didn't believe in battle fatigue. He didn't believe in shell shock. In Patton's worldview, forged in the cavalry traditions of the American West and refined in the mechanized warfare of World War I, there were only two kinds of men, those who fought and those who ran. He had no patience for what doctors were beginning to recognize as legitimate psychological trauma from combat. 1 week after the Cool incident, on August 10th, Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Santo Stefano. There he encountered Private Paul G. Bennett, a 21-year-old artillery private from South Carolina. Bennett had been in continuous combat since the North African campaign. He had performed well in Tunisia. He had fought bravely in Sicily. But now, sitting on his cot, Bennett was shaking. He was feverish, dehydrated, and emotionally exhausted from witnessing his best friend being severely wounded. When Patton asked what was wrong, Bennett replied through tears, "It's my nerves. I can't stand the shelling anymore." Patton's reaction was even more violent than before. He screamed that Bennett was a goddamn coward and a yellow son of a bitch. He slapped Bennett across the face with his hand. Then, in front of dozens of wounded men and medical staff, Patton drew his pearl-handled pistol, waved it in Bennett's face, and shouted that Bennett ought to be lined up against a wall and shot. Hospital personnel rushed forward, pulling Bennett away as Patton ordered the hospital commander to remove that yellow bastard immediately. The witnesses to this second incident were horrified. Medical staff had tolerated the first slapping as perhaps an unfortunate moment of temper, but this crossed a line. Colonel Richard T. Arnest, the I-2 Corps surgeon, wrote a detailed report and sent it up the chain of command. He sent one copy to Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of Tour Corps, and another to Brigadier General Frederick A. Blessey, chief surgeon at Allied Force Headquarters in North Africa. Bradley, despite his personal feelings about Patton, locked the report in his safe. He knew Patton's value to the war effort. Bradley understood that Patton, for all his faults, was an irreplaceable combat commander. But Blessey sent his copy directly to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Mediterranean. On August 17th, Eisenhower dispatched a letter to Patton that was both a reprimand and a warning. "I clearly understand that firm and drastic measures are at times necessary in order to secure the desired objectives," Eisenhower wrote. "But this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates. I feel that the personal services you have rendered the United States and the Allied cause during the past weeks are of incalculable value. But nevertheless, if there is a very considerable element of truth in the allegations accompanying this letter, I must so seriously question your good judgment and your self-discipline as to raise serious doubts in my mind as to your future usefulness." Eisenhower ordered Patton to personally apologize to both soldiers, to the medical staffs of both hospitals, and to every division in the 7th Army. It was a humiliating punishment for a proud man. Privately, Eisenhower had already made his decision. He wrote to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, "If this thing ever gets out, they'll be howling for Patton's scalp, and that will be the end of Georgie's service in this war. I simply cannot let that happen. Patton is indispensable to the war effort, one of the guarantors of our victory." For 3 months, the story remained secret. 60 American and British war correspondents in Sicily knew about at least one of the incidents. They had investigated, interviewed witnesses, and verified the accounts. But they agreed among themselves to suppress the story for the sake of the American effort. They recognized that Patton, despite his character flaws, was essential to winning the war. The secret held until November 21, 1943, at exactly 7 p.m. Eastern Time, when radio broadcaster Drew Pearson opened his Sunday evening program on the Blue Network. Pearson was known for his investigative journalism and his Washington Merry-Go-Round column that exposed government secrets and official misconduct. His source was Ernest Cuneo, an official with the Office of Strategic Services, who had access to War Department files. Pearson's broadcast was sensational and, as it turned out, somewhat inaccurate in details. He conflated elements of both slappings, falsely reported that one soldier was out of his head, telling Patton to duck or shells would hit him, and claimed Patton had been severely reprimanded, which was technically untrue in military terminology, but the core truth was devastating enough. America's most famous fighting general had struck soldiers suffering from combat stress. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The Associated Press contacted the War Department that same evening. The next morning, Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers issued a carefully worded statement. "General Patton has never been reprimanded at any time by General Eisenhower or by anybody else in this theater." Every word was technically true. In Army terminology, a reprimand is an official punishment following formal disciplinary procedures. Eisenhower had sent Patton a private letter of criticism, not an official reprimand. But to the American public, the denial sounded like a cover-up. Within days, Congress erupted in demands for Patton's dismissal. Representative Jed Johnson of Oklahoma called Patton's actions a despicable incident and demanded his immediate removal from command. Representative Charles B. Hoven of Iowa, himself a combat veteran, questioned whether the Army had become too dominated by hard-boiled officers with too much blood and guts. Newspaper editorials across the country called for Patton's court-martial. Some compared him to Hitler. One editorial cartoon depicted Patton with a striking resemblance to the Führer. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Public opinion was deeply divided. The father of Private Charles Cool, Herman F. Cool of Mishawaka, Indiana, wrote to his congressman expressing forgiveness for Patton, an endorsement of his command style. "We need firm leadership to win this war," Cool's father wrote. The Saturday Evening Post reported that mail was running 5-1 in favor of Patton. polls showed majority support for keeping him in command. Many Americans, particularly those with military experience or family members in combat, viewed Patton's actions as stern discipline rather than abuse. The controversy raged through late November and early December 1943. The Senate delayed Patton's promotion to permanent major general. Eisenhower faced intense pressure from politicians and press to relieve Patton of command. But Eisenhower, Marshall, and even President Franklin Roosevelt understood something crucial. America needed Patton. He was one of only a handful of American generals with proven ability to conduct large-scale mechanized warfare. The coming invasion of Europe would be the most complex military operation in history. They couldn't afford to lose one of their best combat commanders over what amounted to a serious lapse in judgment rather than a criminal act. So, Patton remained in the service, but his punishment was severe in ways the public never fully appreciated. Following the capture of Messina in August 1943, Patton did not command forces in combat for 11 months. 11 months. For a man like Patton, bred for war, obsessed with military glory, and desperate to prove his worth, this was torture. He watched from the sidelines as other generals, including his former subordinate Omar Bradley, were selected to lead the greatest invasion in military history. In September 1943, Bradley was chosen to command the 1st United States Army, forming in England to prepare for Operation Overlord, the invasion of northern France. Patton was passed over. The decision had been made before the slapping incidents became public, but Patton believed the scandal had cost him the command of his dreams. He was relegated to training duties, sitting idle in England while the fate of Europe hung in the balance. But then something remarkable happened, something that would transform Patton's disgrace into strategic advantage. In late 1943 and early 1904, Allied planners were wrestling with the most dangerous challenge of Operation Overlord: how to keep German forces divided and confused about where and when the invasion would occur. The success of D-Day depended on surprise and deception. If the Germans concentrated their forces at the actual landing beaches in Normandy, the invasion might fail. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers could die on the beaches. The war could drag on for years. The answer was Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate military deception in history. And at the center of Operation Fortitude was the disgraced general who couldn't lead real troops into battle, George S. Patton. The plan was brilliant in its psychology. The Allies would create an entirely fictional army group, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly stationed in southeastern England across the Strait of Dover from Pas-de-Calais, France. This phantom army would threaten an invasion at Calais, the shortest crossing of the English Channel and the most obvious invasion route. To make this deception credible, FUSAG needed a commander the Germans would believe would lead the main Allied assault force. Enter Patton. Despite what Hollywood would later claim in the 1970 film, Patton, German military intelligence hadn't spent the war obsessing over him. Recent scholarship by historian Harry Truman has shown that, for most of the war, German commanders barely took notice of Patton. His performance in Tunisia was solid but not spectacular. His race to Palermo in Sicily went through territory the Germans had already abandoned. German General Eberhard Rauth, who commanded the 15th Panzergrenadier Division against Patton in Sicily, thought the American 7th Army fought hesitantly and predictably. But by late 1943, after his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, Patton had gained enough reputation, enough visibility, that the Germans knew his name. More importantly, Patton was the most famous American general in the public eye. If Allied intelligence could convince the Germans that Patton was commanding a massive force in southeastern England, the deception might work. On January 26, 1944, Patton was formally given command of the Third Army and ordered to England. But the Third Army wouldn't become operational until after D-Day. Patton's real job was to command something that didn't exist: FUSAG. The deception involved layers of sophisticated techniques. Dummy tanks made from inflatable rubber and canvas were positioned across southeastern England. Fake landing craft constructed from wood and steel drums floated in harbors near Dover. Temporary buildings suggesting military encampments appeared in fields visible from the air. Patton made highly publicized visits to these fake facilities, always with photographers present to ensure the images reached German intelligence. But the real deception was more subtle. British intelligence ran a network of double agents. German spies who had been captured and turned to work for the Allies. These agents sent carefully crafted messages back to Germany describing FUSAG in convincing detail. One agent codenamed Brutus, actually a Polish officer named Roman Garbi Czerniawski, reported that he had been appointed as a liaison officer between Free Polish Forces and Patton's FUSAG headquarters. Another agent, codenamed Garbo, actually a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, sent elaborate reports about FUSAG units, their locations, and their apparent preparations for invasion. Radio operators transmitted thousands of fake messages, simulating the communications of a massive army group. The messages were encoded, making them seem legitimate to German intelligence trying to decrypt them. Allied aircraft bombed the Calais region even more heavily than Normandy, suggesting that Calais was the primary target. Every detail was designed to create a coherent, believable threat. The key was Patton. The Germans had to believe he was commanding this force because he was, in their estimation, the most aggressive and capable American armor commander. After the war, German General Günther Blumentritt stated, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander." Throughout the spring of 1904, as Allied forces prepared for the real invasion of Normandy, Patton played his role perfectly. He gave speeches at women's clubs in southeastern England. He inspected troops that didn't exist. He met with officials while German agents watched. He became the most visible Allied commander in Britain, always appearing in areas that suggested an assault on Calais. The deception had to continue even after D-Day. On June 6, 1904, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Germans had to believe it was a feint, a diversionary attack before the main assault at Calais. Patton couldn't appear in Normandy. He had to remain visibly in England, commanding his Phantom Army, keeping German reserves pinned at Calais. The strategy worked beyond anyone's hopes. When the Allies landed in Normandy, Hitler and the German High Command believed it was exactly what Allied intelligence wanted them to believe, a diversion. For 7 crucial weeks after D-Day, Hitler refused to send reinforcements from the Pas-de-Calais area to Normandy. He kept waiting for Patton's real invasion that never came. German forces remained divided, unable to concentrate their strength against the actual Allied beachhead in Normandy. The deception was so successful that as late as July 1944, 2 months after the Normandy landings, German intelligence still believed FUSAG existed. Intercepted German communications showed they were tracking Patton's supposed army movements. The Phantom General commanding a Phantom Army had fooled the most sophisticated military machine of its time. Finally, in late July 1904, Patton got his chance at redemption. The Third Army, which had been forming and training in England while Patton played his deception role, became operational in France on August 1, 1944. Patton flew to Normandy and took command. The man who had been sidelined for nearly a year was unleashed. What followed was one of the most remarkable campaigns in military history. The Third Army exploited the Allied breakout from Normandy and raced across France. In less than a month, Patton's forces advanced over 400 miles. They liberated Paris, Chartres, Orléans, and scores of other French cities and towns. They moved so fast that they outran their supply lines. Patton's tanks literally ran out of fuel near the German border in late August because the supply system couldn't keep up with his advance. The numbers from the Third Army's campaign are staggering and worth understanding in detail. Between August 1, 1904, when the Third Army became operational, and May 9, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Third Army fought continuously for 281 days. They crossed 24 major rivers. They captured more than 81,500 square miles of territory. They liberated or conquered more than 12,000 cities, towns, and villages. And the enemy casualties they inflicted tell the true story of the Third Army's effectiveness. According to the official Third Army After Action report from May 1945, verified by multiple post-war military histories, the Third Army captured 1,080,688 prisoners of war. They killed 114,400 enemy soldiers and wounded 386,200. The total enemy losses attributable to the Third Army were 11,388 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Let that sink in for a moment. One army, under one commander, accounted for over 1.8 million enemy casualties. The Third Army inflicted casualties at a ratio of more than 10 to 1 compared to their own losses. The Third Army suffered 16,596 killed, 96,241 wounded, and 26,809 missing in action, for a total of 139,146 casualties. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement came in December 1904, during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1904, Hitler launched his last major offensive on the Western Front. Two German panzer armies smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The surprise attack created a dangerous bulge in the Allied front, threatening to split American and British forces. The German offensive aimed to capture the vital port of Antwerp and force the Allies to negotiate a separate peace. At the strategic crossroads town of Bastogne, American forces, including the 101st Airborne Division, were surrounded. They were running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The weather was terrible, preventing air resupply. If Bastogne fell, the Germans might achieve their breakthrough. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of senior commanders at Verdun on December 19th. The mood was grim. The German attack had caught everyone by surprise. Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take to turn the Third Army northward to counterattack the German salient. What Patton said next stunned everyone in the room. On December 20th, with 3 divisions. The other generals thought he was joking or exaggerating. It seemed impossible. The Third Army was in northeastern France, oriented toward the east, conducting offensive operations against German fortifications. To wheel the entire army 90 degrees north, across terrible winter roads, coordinating the movement of hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, while maintaining combat effectiveness, would be an almost superhuman logistical achievement. What nobody knew was that Patton had already prepared for exactly this scenario. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning since early November that German forces were building up opposite the Ardennes sector. Patton, trusting Koch's analysis, had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a rapid pivot northward. When Eisenhower asked the question, Patton already had detailed movement orders ready. On December 22nd, the Third Army attacked. Within 3 days, they had covered over 100 miles in terrible winter conditions, fought through German defenses, and were approaching Bastogne. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and reached the surrounded defenders. The siege of Bastogne was lifted. The relief of Bastogne has been called one of the greatest achievements of logistics and battlefield leadership in military history. Patton had moved more than 133,000 vehicles, an average distance of over 11 miles per vehicle, turned his entire army 90 degrees, and launched a successful offensive in less than a week in the middle of winter against determined enemy resistance. The German generals who faced the Third Army were grudgingly impressed. General der Panzertruppen Erich Brandenberger acknowledged after the war, Patton had given proof of his extraordinary skill in armored warfare, which he conducted according to the fundamental German conception. Heinz Guderian, the German pioneer of blitzkrieg tactics, said when interrogated in 1945, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." From January through May 1945, the Third Army continued its relentless advance into Germany. They crossed the Rhine, liberated concentration camps including Buchenwald, captured Frankfurt and Trier, and drove deep into Austria and Czechoslovakia. By VE Day on May 8, 1945, they were the farthest east of any American forces in Europe. Throughout this campaign, Patton remained the warrior he had always been. He was profane, aggressive, demanding, and utterly focused on destroying the enemy. His soldiers grumbled about his strict uniform requirements and his insistence on discipline even in combat zones. They joked that his nickname, Old Blood and Guts, really meant our blood, his guts. But they also recognized his genius for armored warfare and his ability to win battles while minimizing American casualties through aggressive offensive action. The story comes full circle in a way that Patton himself never fully appreciated. The man who slapped 2 soldiers in August 1943, who was nearly cashiered from the service in disgrace, who spent 11 months in professional purgatory, became the phantom general whose reputation deceived the Germans, whose phantom army kept German reserves paralyzed during the crucial weeks after D-Day, and whose real army liberated more territory and captured more enemy soldiers than any other American army in Europe. Without the slapping incidents, Patton might have been chosen to lead forces in the initial D-Day assault. He would have been too important, too visible, too operationally engaged to serve as the figurehead for Operation Fortitude. The deception might have failed. German reinforcements might have crushed the Normandy beachhead. D-Day itself might have failed, with catastrophic consequences for the war. In one of history's great ironies, Patton's moment of greatest shame set in motion the chain of events that made him strategically invaluable. His disgrace made him available for the deception role that helped ensure D-Day's success. His redemption campaign with the Third Army proved that Eisenhower and Marshall had been right to keep him in service, despite the scandal. The soldiers he slapped both survived the war. Private Charles Coole recovered from his malaria and dysentery, returned to combat, and later said of Patton, "I think at the time it happened, he was pretty well worn out himself. The fact that he was a great general overshadows the incident. It was nothing." Private Paul Bennett also returned to combat after recovering from combat fatigue and completed his service honorably. As for Patton himself, he never fully understood the psychological reality of battle fatigue or combat stress. He remained a man of his era, shaped by cavalry traditions and a romanticized view of warfare that didn't account for the psychological toll of modern mechanized combat. But his inability to comprehend mental trauma in war doesn't diminish his operational brilliance or his achievements as a combat commander. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He was 60 years old. He never returned to the United States after the war ended. He's buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the Third Army he commanded. The legacy of the slapping incidents and their aftermath reveals something profound about leadership, strategy, and the unpredictable nature of history. A moment of rage that should have ended a career instead temporarily sidelined a general, making him available for a deception role that contributed significantly to the most important military operation of World War II. The coward became the phantom who fooled Hitler. The disgraced general became the liberator of France. It's a reminder that history doesn't move in straight lines, that disgrace and redemption can be separated by mere months, and that sometimes the very thing that destroys a career creates the circumstances for its greatest triumph. Patton's slapping incidents could have been the end of his story. Instead, they became a crucial chapter in a larger narrative of deception, strategy, and ultimately, victory. The next time you read about Operation Fortitude and the Phantom Army that deceived Germany, or about the Third Army's race across France, or about the relief of Bastogne, remember the field hospital in Sicily, where an angry general slapped a sick soldier and nearly threw away his career? Remember that moment of fury that became, through a series of unlikely circumstances, a key element in the Allied victory in Europe. In war, as in life, we cannot always predict how our failures will shape our futures, or how our darkest moments might create opportunities for our greatest achievements. George S. Patton's story is ultimately about redemption, but it's also about strategy, sacrifice, and the strange paths by which history unfolds. The man they called a coward saved a day not despite his disgrace, but because of it. If you found this story fascinating and want to learn more about the untold stories of World War II, please like, comment, and subscribe. History is full of these incredible intersections, where personal failure meets strategic necessity, where disgrace becomes opportunity, and where the path to victory runs through the most unexpected places.